So good morning and welcome to the hearing on civil and human rights. At this time, we ask if you could please place phones on vibrate or silent mode. Thank you for your cooperation, Chair. Ready to begin.
Good morning. My name is Natasha Williams, and I serve as the chair on the Committee of Civil and Human Rights. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this hearing today on the Racial Justice Commission, also known as the RJC, and its related ballot measures. With the next election only 13 days away, this hearing will give us an important opportunity to understand the proposals on our ballots this year. Structural racism is not a new phenomenon, especially to those who are victims of it. Though marginalized groups have long suffered injustices, events in recent years have made it apparent that we cannot let the cycle created by oppressive systems continue. BIPOC and other marginalized groups have been set up to fail by these systems. I think yesterday at the Equity Summit, it was a current theme that, these systems aren't broken. These systems are designed exactly how they were meant to be. The formation of the Racial Justice Commission was a step toward righting these wrongs. The Racial Justice Commission was tasked with conducting a public outreach campaign where they met with community leaders, organizations, stakeholders, and members of the public affected by these inequities to determine which patterns of inequity are most prevalent. They released an interim report in October 2021 where they identified 6 main patterns. They continued on to a second round of outreach, after which a final report was released in December of 2021. Based on their research and testimony received, they have proposed 3 ballot measures for New Yorkers to vote on this year's general election. Today, we'll learn more about these proposals and the process undertaken to determine how they will benefit those affected by racial inequity. I'd like to thank committee staff as well as my staff for their work on putting this hearing together, as well as my colleagues that have joined us to discuss the long-term solutions we cannot use to root out structural racism and increase equity within our great city. I said not use, I meant we can use to root out structural racism and increase equity within our great city. And with that, I'll turn to Public Advocate Jumaane Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As mentioned, my name is Jumaane Williams, Public Advocate of the City of New York. Thank you and the members of the Committee on Civil and Human Rights for holding this hearing and allowing me the opportunity to provide a statement. I'd also like to thank the Racial Justice Commission for all the work they've done thus far to ensure that all New Yorkers are informed about the ballot measures and are encouraged to vote. Of course, thank you, Chair Austin Jones and Executive Director Harold Miller and the staff and the entire commission that was there. Some great folks. I do want to shout out to Joanne Yu, who was a member of my transition committee, and Kay Bain, who is my brother from another since college when he was actually a part of the problem. It's just been great to see him grow. First as my legislative director and budget director to a commission and doing great work on gun violence. But we had a lot of great members there who does great work for this city. For nearly 3 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated and exposed the racial inequities that have continued to impact New York City. While all New Yorkers have been affected by the pandemic, data shows that communities of more color have been hit the hardest, economically, socially, and health-wise. At the same time, violence and hate crimes have worsened and reinforced the racism that remains present in our city. The system has been structured to marginalize people on the basis of race across all areas of life. I hope we can all work together to create a more just and equitable city for all New Yorkers. In preparation for this upcoming election, it is very important that New Yorkers remember to turn over the ballot, as we will be voting on 3 ballot measures. The Racial Justice Commission based these measures on community engagement input. They spoke to community leaders and experts by conducting public meetings where they would record all the information and ideas given and turn them into proposed charter changes. After obtaining all this data, they published an in-depth report that includes the final 3 measures they are pushing towards the path of racial equity and justice, and I'm proud to have provided a testimony myself. New Yorkers will have the chance to vote for measures that will help to dismantle structural and institutional racism. The first ballot measure is to add a statement of values to guide the government. The subject matter of this preamble will be used as a guideline for what the city government must fulfill and how they must execute their duties. Currently, New York City Charter does not have a preamble. If this is implemented, the city government will have to follow the core values and vision that New Yorkers have determined. Second ballot measure is to establish a Racial Equity Office Planning Commission. During the Racial Justice Commission, they found that many New Yorkers and leaders have expressed that they have always been a lack of prominence on racial equity in regards to city decision-making and policies. The creation of a Racial Equity Office is required to work with all the city agencies and train and provide assistance to them on racial equity. As for the Racial Equity Plan, this will require the mayor to create a citywide plan and agencies to create agency-specific plans every 2 years. This would include the goals and strategy for improving racial equity and justice and the creation of a commission on racial equity. The last ballot proposal is to measure the true cost of living. This requires the city government to create a true cost of living measure to track how much the actual cost in New York City of meeting essential needs, which include food, childcare, housing. The calculation will not include any sort of additional assistance, whether it is public or private. This way, it will allow for an accurate result on making decisions and creating new policy. The city is also required to report annually on this measure. We have a duty to rework the codification of our city's charter to address the persistent racism and inequality and inequity. It is important time to address the barriers Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle East, and all people of more color in New York City face on a daily basis, as well as additional barriers faced by LGBTQ and disabled people of color, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, just to name some. If these proposals pass, we will be able to move towards an equitable and just city. This will bring new opportunities to those who have disproportionately been negatively impacted for generations. I hope as a city we can move forward with these proposals after this upcoming election. And while I'm always glad we're making sure that we're inclusive of everyone, which we need to be. Apparently, the further you are away from being an affluent white male, the tougher you will have it. But I always want to make sure we lift up the very unique anti-Black racism that has persisted for a very long time. And it's important that we keep that as part of the conversation. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Public Advocate. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues that are here, Councilmember Richardson Jordan, Joseph, and Marte, who was here earlier.
Thank you, Chair Williams. Good morning and welcome. My name is Jace Regan-Apathy, and I am counsel to the Committee on Civil and Human Rights. Before we begin testimony today, I would like to remind everyone that is joining us via Zoom that you will be on mute until you are called on to testify. I will be calling on public witnesses to testify after the conclusion of the administration's testimony and council member questions, so please listen carefully for your name to be called. Council members, you will be called on for questions after the full panel has completed their testimony. Please note, for the purposes of this hearing, we will be allowing a second round of questioning. And for public witnesses, once your name is called, if you are joining via Zoom, a member of our staff will unmute you, and the Sergeant at Arms will give you the go-ahead to begin. So please listen out for that. I will now swear in the administration. We will now call representatives of the administration to testify. We will be hearing testimony from the Racial Justice Commission, and we will have the Mayor's Office of Equity available for questions. Panelists, can you please raise your right hands? Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions?
I don't want to be out of line, but the commission is not the administration of the city of New York. We're not the city of New York. It's an independent body. It was appointed by the commission is not, it's not part of the administration of the city of New York. It was appointed by the mayor, but it's an independent body.
No problem. We still have to swear you into testimony.
No, I understand,
yes.
but I just want to be clear because we're not the administration, so you're swearing in the administration. Just wanted to be clear
No
about
problem. We can swear in the Racial Justice Commission and
That
the
was my
Mayor's
point.
Office of Equity.
that. Yes.
Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before the committee, and respond honestly to council member questions?
Yes.
Okay. At this time, Chair Jones-Austin, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chair Williams and members of the Committee on Civil Rights and Human Rights. Good morning specifically to Councilmember Joseph, Councilmember Richardson Jordan, and also good morning to you, Public Advocate Williams. We are very glad to be here. My name is Jennifer Jones-Austin, and I am the chair of the New York City Racial Justice Commission. In addition, I am the CEO of FPWA, an anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization based here in New York City. The Commission's Vice Chair is Henry Garrido, Executive Director of DC 37. And there are 9 additional commissioners: Kay Bain, Honor Bermudez, who is with us today, Fred Davey, Laree Daniel Favors, Derek Hamilton, Chris Coy, who also is here with us, Yesenia Mata, Phil Thompson, and Joanne Yu. I'm also joined at this hearing by Executive Director Harold Miller and commission staff, Melanie Ash, our General Counsel, Jimmy Pan, Director of Policy, and Sam Stanton, Deputy Director of Policy. And also at the table with us is the New York City Commissioner of Equity, Sadia Sherman. The Racial Justice Commission, which is a charter revision commission appointed by the former mayor, Bill de Blasio, is the first of its kind in the city and the first of its kind in the nation. The 3 ballot questions that we have presented to New York City voters are the first of their kind in the nation and in the city. These 3 ballot questions will give New Yorkers the chance to decide the future of their own city. They are designed to promote equity and justice for all New Yorkers. I want to thank you, Chair Williams, for giving the Commission the opportunity to provide a contextual understanding of these proposals, why and how they came to be, and how the Commission intended them to lay the foundation for uprooting structural racism here in New York City. Racism in our city, as in the rest of America, is baked into our institutions, society, and cultural norms, from education to housing to the criminal legal system. We know the history of our city is deeply entangled with the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and segregation. Indeed, the very founding of our city was through the removal and displacement of the original Lenape people from this land. Since the 17th century, financial gains from the displacement of indigenous persons and the forced labor of enslaved Africans were foundational to the city's prosperity. Racialized hierarchy became the justification for these atrocities and subsequent violence, segregation, and disinvestment. Today, structural racism continues to define our reality. We know that there are great racial disparities in New York City based upon health, wealth, and other indicators of well-being. Those disparities are a reflection of the legacy of structural racism. For example, almost 100 years ago, redlining and inequitable development pushed BIPOC communities and other low-income communities to the margins in our society. BIPOC meaning Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color. And today we see that many of those same redline New York City neighborhoods were hit hardest by COVID-19. These same neighborhoods continue to suffer through disinvestment, segregated schools, and worse health outcomes. These patterns that reverberate today are part of our city's past, but they don't have to be our future. For as long as there has been injustice in our city, there have been people of all backgrounds speaking out and fighting for something better. For hundreds of years, New York City has been a geographical center in the struggle for freedom. Our city has been home to countless thinkers, leaders, artists, and everyday people who challenged us to live up to our values. But for their work, struggle, and imagination, we would not be here today. The tragic killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery shocked the conscience of our nation and ignited protests nationwide, demanding a long overdue reckoning with systemic and structural racism in our country and city. The pandemic also highlighted the pervasive nature of structural racism and social determinants of health, how they led to worse outcomes among BIPOC New Yorkers, not just from COVID-19, but also in adverse health outcomes over the full course of their lives. The summer of 2020 was a bleak reminder that structural racism is a matter of life and death. The grief and rage of New Yorkers of all backgrounds was a call to action. As the city dealt with these crises, these symptoms of structural racism, dealing with all of them, then Mayor Bill de Blasio believed that it could be time for an unprecedented approach. He convened the Racial Commission and tasked it with examining the city's foundational law and formulating changes that would uproot structural racism. The mayor appointed a diverse group of 11 commissioners with deep experience representing communities of color and decades of advocacy, program, and policy experience, both inside and outside of city government. The commission had a new opportunity to investigate why decades of policy and programming has failed to close the gaps experienced by marginalized communities of color and to examine the structures and foundations of our city government. The Commission began its ambitious mission by speaking to as many people as it could. The Commission heard from people across the city and across the nation who are experts in their own lives, in the stories of their communities, in their subject matter and academic discipline, or in the ways our foundations needed to be changed. The Commission held in-person meetings across the 5 boroughs during the pandemic, when few other entities were doing so, and held virtual meetings for those who could not be present on site. It opened online portals for people to submit ideas and spoke with leaders across agencies and government. And I should add, not just New York City government, the city of New York, but also the state, and even at the national level, the federal level. The Commission sought stories to understand the effects of structural racism and sought big ideas to reverse the tide. We heard many hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of data points, as well as ideas that people had to fix this policy or that policy. But we promised to deliver a manageable number of ballot proposals that New York City voters could easily understand. It wouldn't be fair to voters to put hundreds of policy tweaks on the ballot. Moreover, the Commission's theory of change was to address root causes. We sought to address a structural problem with structural solutions. So upon listening to these many stories and ideas, the Commission identified 6 patterns of inequity that have plagued the city for decades and for centuries. These 6 patterns were: 1, inequity in quality services that promote social and emotional well-being; 2, inequity in work, advancement, and wealth building; 3, inequity within and across neighborhoods that inhibit thriving individuals, families, and communities; 4, marginalization and overcriminalization of BIPOC persons and communities; 5, inequity in representation in decision-making; and 6, lack of enforcement and accountability of government and entities. It became clear that our city charter did not address these systemic patterns of inequity in a systematic way. While there may be policies and even laws to address the symptoms of these patterns and tackle them downstream, the city government doesn't have at its core a foundation for doing so. In this way, we risk perpetuating these inequities. Policy and practice and program alone cannot get the city moved and out of structural racism. If it is to build it into its foundation, we must change the laws. With that in mind, the Commission arrived at 3 ballot proposals designed to establish a new foundation through aspiration, action, and accountability. To begin, would you like me to stop? Okay.
No. So if you want to, because we have a lot of questions, or not a lot, some questions on the ballot proposals. So maybe you could hold the following sections and you can incorporate them in the answers that
Good deal.
we have for the questions. And I don't know if you want to skip to the commonly received questions in conclusion or just go to the conclusion.
Why don't we, if you'd like, we can talk about the commonly received, whatever you would prefer I do. Chair, you tell me what to do.
I think you can mention the commonly received
Okay.
questions and then the conclusion, and then we'll ask you tons of questions on the ballot proposals themselves.
Good deal. Thank you. So we have been, for the last several months, since the ballot proposals were voted out by the Commission in December of 2021, we've been talking with New Yorkers, having community conversations. We've engaged through social media. We've done a lot of public outreach with institutions across the city of New York. And what we have heard over the course of these last several months are questions that center sometimes on cost of the proposals, particularly the cost of the new offices. And while the proposed charter amendment does not prescribe a specific budget, we estimate that the cost of staffing for the core functions of the office to be under $10 million. Now, what I want to point out is that that is $10 million out of a more than $100 billion budget. That is 0.1% of the New York City budget, the citywide expense budget. The Commission's intent behind the proposed racial equity infrastructure is that if we do this, in some ways, it's preventive in nature. And so what that would do is mitigate downstream impacts, thereby having the potential to actually save the city money in the long run. We've also heard about I should add that, from our perspective, we believe that the cost of implementing the proposal will be more than offset by the savings that are generated. There's been a recent McKinsey study that has estimated that the racial gap here in America could close if we focused on racial equity. It could close, the racial wealth gap, and that we could grow our gross domestic product between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion by the year 2028. The point being that if we invest in racial equity, we could actually grow the GDP, grow our economy, and racial equity actually pays for itself and helps us to grow as a nation. And I just add that that doesn't account for the savings that we would experience if we addressed, through racial equity, negative health outcomes, crime-related outcomes, educational attainment outcomes, labor inefficiencies, and other downstream symptoms. We heard from, not so much from New Yorkers, but we heard sometimes from the media about the generality of these proposals. Some said they wanted them to be more specific, perhaps to address specific policy gaps that contribute to disparate outcomes. We stated just a short while ago that the Commission was laser focused on making structural changes and resetting foundational values. Essentially, we try to create an overarching framework for doing the work on a continual basis. We focused on a whole the whole of New York City government. That was the approach we took to racial equity. And instead of offering hundreds of policy solutions to many different issues, we sought to put in place a system and a structure to help the city make fairer and more just policy and program decisions on a going forward basis and in perpetuity. Lastly, I just want to say at this particular time, actually there are 2 points that I'll touch upon. We heard about these proposals perhaps creating a private right of action, and left and right people beginning to sue the city, individual lawsuits being brought against the city. These proposals expressly do not create a private right of action. We made sure of that. They do not create an avenue for plaintiffs seeking monetary damages to sue the city. They cast a vision to help inform and guide government in policy and decision making. They were written in such a way that they would not allow for a private right of action. And then I also just want to recognize, and our public advocate spoke to this point, that they do not center specifically on Black New Yorkers. We understand and we acknowledge, as a Black woman, I understand. I've lived. I just don't have to acknowledge. But I've lived the experience of being a Black here in America. And so I want to acknowledge the reality of the hurt that Black Americans feel. And we know that we have been greatly impacted and continue to be impacted, and sometimes disparately, by structural racism. That was at the core of our work. We know that the root of structural racism in this country and in this city is anti-Blackness. Without a doubt, the experiences of Black New Yorkers were at the forefront of our thinking that went into these proposals. But we also know that other persons of color have also experienced racism and inequity. And we believed that if we are a multiracial and a multi-diverse group of people here in New York City, and the Commission itself being multiracial and multi-diverse, that we needed to attack these issues with a multiracial approach. We needed to look at uprooting structural racism as a whole. And so the work of the Commission was deeply grounded in cross-racial solidarity and a broad, expansive, and intersectional understanding of racial justice and the intersectional issues that attend. We heard and we felt the pains of the Latinx community and the Asian community, and about specific issues to women of color, to people with disabilities, to the LGBTQ plus community, to immigrants, and many more. Many of these persons and their struggles are rooted in the very same structures. Our task was to reimagine the structures that would promote racial and equity justice of all kinds for everybody. And as a result, we centered on the antithesis to racism: inclusivity, even while recognizing that it is Black communities and Indigenous persons that have borne and continue to bear the most horrific injustices of our history. And so there are some who suggest that our existing anti-discrimination laws are sufficient to eliminate racism within and among our institutions, rendering these ballot measures unnecessary. I want to highlight that the Commission heard repeatedly from New Yorkers and experts in the field alike that despite our laws and our programs being race neutral on their face, their impact continues to entrench and perpetuate disparities. Consistent with that testimony, the ballot proposals reflect the Commission's determination that neutrality will not reverse structural racism. We believe that for laws, policy, and programs to undo racism embedded into our foundations and status quo, that our laws have to be proactive in reducing the 6 patterns that we identified. And so I want to thank you, Chair, committee members, and our public advocate for the invitation to speak on the Commission's work and the ballot questions. We're now engaged in the campaign. We will be through Election Day to inform 5.5 New York City voters about these ballot questions. We're not telling people how to vote on our proposals as a commission, but we're trying to empower them with education to make an informed decision. And you'll see that we'll be on TV, radio, billboards in your communities. We're partnering with trusted community-based organizations throughout the boroughs. We thank you for this opportunity for you all to help bring the word to all New Yorkers. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I will start with a few questions on the Racial Justice Commission itself. So RJC was first formed in March of 2021 and released its initial report in October of that same year. The commission's final report was released in December 2021. Could you share with us the selection criteria and process for selecting the members of RJC?
Indeed. So just to be very specific, the mayor of New York City announced during the pandemic that he was centering on the experiences of communities of color that had been greatly impacted by COVID. He had already convened a task force on racial inclusion and equity in the city of New York, and it was actually led by our now Commissioner of Equity for the city of New York, Sadia Sherman. But he appreciated, again, that we needed to focus on structural inequities, structural laws, and to look at the city charter. He reached out to me and told me that he was creating this commission, asked me if I would engage with him in this work. I agreed to, and then he told me that he wanted me to serve as chair of the commission. And then we went about the work of identifying a co-chair, appreciating that Henry Garrido, executive director of DC 37, has, as an executive director, long focused on the experience of communities of color, and that DC 37 is heavily comprised of persons of color of all races and ethnicities, but largely in the main people of color here in New York City. We agreed that he should be the vice chair, and he agreed to do so. And then we went to we went about the work of identifying people throughout the city of New York, people who have long committed themselves, whether working in government or outside of government, working in community-based organizations, working as agitators, sometimes working as advocates, sometimes working alongside government, but people of the community who really had been taking up the issues of the community as it concerns longstanding systemic inequities. And so we engaged with these New Yorkers. We made sure that we had representation from the Asian community, from the community of people of Hispanic origin, and from persons of African descent. We made sure that the committee was also diverse with respect to identities, whether it be, orientation, gender identity, whether it be, race and ethnicity. We wanted a commission that was diverse. The mayor decided, I'll just make this a point of note, the mayor decided that we've long heard from Caucasian persons about how they would run the city and these issues, and he made a very expressed decision that he wanted the commission to be led and moved by commissioners with lived experience when it comes to racism.
Thank you. I know you mentioned how you all went about gathering information to produce the draft report and the final report. So could you give us more of an insider's perspective on how you sort of synthesized all that you heard? I know you held quite a few sort of hearings across the city.
The conversations with New Yorkers over the course of, I guess it was about maybe 4 or 5 months, was very compelling. People came out. We had elected officials come out. We had persons who, maybe never had testified before or come before a body convened by an administration official to share their experiences. We heard people share with us what it was like to walk the streets of New York and be harassed by police officers. We heard people talk about their experiences trying to get a better educational opportunity for their children. We heard people talk about working in city government and being overlooked for hirings and promotions, receiving outstanding performance evaluations, but still not receiving an audience when it came to getting a raise or a promotion. We heard people talk about their lived experience in public housing. We heard people talk about, lack of not the inability to secure licenses to become vendors of services, the inability to, receive a contract from the city of New York. And so much of what they shared was rooted in racism, and we could see it. What really grabbed me, especially when we talked with experts, people who are working on policies and programs, sometimes working in and with government, sometimes working outside of government, people who were brought in as thought leaders both here in New York City and also outside of New York City, was very often people shared their experiences, and when they offered solutions, they talked more about programs, policies. And I'm just going to share that what it helped me to appreciate is that we as a nation have actually, this is my take, we've been conditioned to believe that we can only think and sometimes put forth solutions within the lines. Like these are the lines that have been drawn. This is the box. And so we've been taught, let's just put forth another program. Let's just put forth another policy. And the commission realized, no, we've got to change the foundations so that we can think, reimagine something greater than what is. Because if we keep doing the policy work, yes, we're going to have to do more policies. But if the policies are based on the laws as they currently are, we're just going to stay in that space. And so it was a great exercise in hearing from people, hearing their thoughts, hearing their pains, but then also the work of translating their pain into real structural change.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the reimagining language. It reminds me of lots of conversations that I've had with friends about being imaginative. And sometimes when we talk about racial equity work, it's exactly what you said. We sort of have our idea of what we've been taught, what we've seen in society, our experiences, and so we try to sort of manipulate what exists. It takes a lot of imagination to think of a different world, to think of a city that has different laws. So I appreciate the commission's efforts to sort of reimagine and not just stick with what we have, but figure out a way to challenge the structure itself.
May I just add,
Yeah,
Chair?
of course.
Just on that point, one of the things that struck us also is that never before have we had the opportunity as a people to write ourselves, people of color, to write ourselves into the laws of this land. And so I think that itself was just, for some people, could we really do this? It's never been done before, not just in New York City, but not in the nation. That everyday New Yorkers get to reimagine and see themselves in the laws of this land, laws that were written without people of color in mind.
Yes, I quoted you at our rally earlier in saying those similar words, so absolutely. The other question I have is, what kind of outreach or education have you done to inform New Yorkers about the ballot proposals ahead of this year's election?
So if I may, Chair, I'm going to turn the mic to our Executive Director, Howard Miller, who is leading the campaign efforts.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I'm Harold Miller, Executive Director for the Commission. And our work around educating New Yorkers, began last year, actually, when we were, receiving input from New Yorkers about, how they imagine racial equity moving forward with ballot measures. We went out to communities around the city, held meetings, held input sessions, And we carry that same energy into the new year, where we work with community-based organizations to help us engage with their constituents around these ballot measures and how we can actually communicate it in languages that they understood. We focused on multilingual campaign targeting all New Yorkers citywide, particularly communities that are less likely to flip the ballot. Our ads, our subways, TV, radio, are in community ethnic media. They're in 14 different languages. We have attended over 30 events. I feel like I do 3 events a night at this point. Over the last several months, our commissioners have been fantastic in going out and engaging with New Yorkers, whether we're in Flatbush one night, whether we're in Rosedale another night. We have been going out to engage with communities about the ballot measures and making sure that folks have a good understanding of it. We also recruited over 160 volunteers to help with phone banking, poll site education. They're going out to spread the word. They're going to cover subways. They're going to use social media channels as well to help us, continue to have deep reach. And our fellow elected officials have been fantastic as well in helping to spread the word, hosting meetings, hosting town halls and such to engage with their constituents as well. So we're have our hands in many different places to engage with New Yorkers across the board.
Thank you. Before I go to ballot proposals or the mayor's Office of Equity, do you have any questions specific to the Racial Justice Commission itself?
Good morning. I just have one small question. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Where does this trickle down into public school education? As the chair of education, we talk about how segregated New York City schools are. How does that work going to impact New York City schools?
So let's first begin with the appreciation that it was once said by a former chancellor within the last 10 years, quoted on the record at the New School for saying, I'm centered on creating, I'm going to go back about 15 years, but I'm not going to call the chancellor's name, but the chancellor said, we're centering on creating not a grade school system, but a system with grade schools. When you have a system with grade schools, that means that not every child is necessarily going to get the highest quality education. And when we appreciate that here in New York City, that where you go to elementary school largely determines where you will go to middle school, and where you go to middle school largely determines where you can go for high school, we have to reset the foundation. We have to look at each and every community and say that children should have the greatest quality education possible in every school, not just in some schools, but in every school. And so what this would look like, if we are able to achieve an Office of Racial Equity that on a continual basis looks at every city office, every city agency, every mayoral office, including the Department of Education, using data, key data points, key indicators, looking at the disparities that persist in education and educational outcomes from one school, one community, and to the next. It will help us to appreciate what more need be done in certain of our communities where the educational outcomes are just trailing so far behind in maybe more of our some of our affluent communities, and then looking at the resources that need to be applied to help children get to a better place. Additionally, I believe that if we do that, then maybe we won't need remediation on the other side for so many of our children who are graduating from high school not prepared to be engaged. Commissioner, is there more that you would add?
Yeah, I mean, not much more to add. I think one of the goals of the ballot measures, and which would be executed by the Office of Racial Equity, is really focused on supporting every city agency to create really clear equity plans, right, that are tied to outcomes, that are publicly accountable, that are measurable. And there's a 2-year lead time to that process. And that would not only include engagement with a new external racial justice commission that's continuing this work, but also with the many advisory boards and bodies that those agencies have as well, right? So that work ideally would start as soon as possible. And I think and it certainly is aligned with the direction of, our current administration as well too. And so ideally that, there's already a commitment, right, to begin to build out that infrastructure, but by what's proposed in the ballot measures, it would make it a requirement for the city moving forward for any administration.
So I too want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I think addressing racial injustice is so important. And I appreciate the spirit of the commission and the spirit of the ballot measures. And I've been telling district residents to vote for them. But I wanted to ask if there was any specific look, especially on the quantitative data side, at city budget and at funding and about how budget is distributed in the city. And if also with the Office of Racial Equity, if there's any specific look at budget dollars and the racial inequality that is related to how we distribute budget in the city.
So I will begin, and then I may ask our Director of Policy to speak a little bit more to this, but I'm saying I may because maybe I'll cover it all, and he may feel that there's not more that need be added. So let me first begin with the fact that the Office of Management and Budget would also be an agency that we'd have to look at for if the Office of Racial Equity budget were to pass and the requirement that the city create biennially a racial equity plan, the Office of Management and Budget would be yet another agency that would be under scrutiny. So let's begin there. And so like how it distributes money and where it's going would be taken a look at. The second thing that I'll add is that the plan would be, would actually be released contemporaneously or to coincide to align with the New York City budget process. And so we would be looking to ensure that, that agencies and mayoral offices are building out plans that then are supported with New York City dollars. And then thirdly, I'll add that when we looked at what next, there was a centering on maybe at some point we would also look at how do we score the budget to make sure that it aligns with the goals of the plan.
And potentially look at the budget within, because you talk about shaking the foundation. So potentially a look at the budget, within government as well. Our district offices have the same budget, but districts like mine certainly deal with far more constituent service cases than, say, districts on, the Upper East Side or what have you. Yet we have the same council budget.
Yes, and if I may add, one of the things that we are very hopeful for is just as you're having a hearing today, that if these proposals pass, that the City Council would be continually engaged at looking at the build-out, the implementation of these proposals. There will be a lot of work over the coming months to look at these, how do we build out these plans and what indicators we are paying attention to. And so I appreciate you raising that point, Council Member, very much.
Thank you. Now I'll turn over to some questions about the ballot proposals. The Racial Justice Commission has submitted 3 ballot proposals for the November ballot. These proposals are multifaceted and would amend the city charter by adding to the preamble, establishing new government entities, and measuring the cost of living. Could you tell us what inspired the first ballot proposal and what impact you anticipate it would have on systematic racism in the city?
So, you may have to cut me off, Chair, because when I talk about these proposals, I get quite excited. I will share with you that when the commissioners began unpacking the charter, one of the things that struck us first was that there was no preamble. no statement of values to guide government in its policy making, in its programming, in how it doles out services. Nothing to guide us to center on who are we and what we believe as a people. How do we value those New Yorkers, residents? What do we think of people, whether they are the more affluent in our city or they are those who have the least resources? What guides us in thinking about New Yorkers, regardless of how they show up, as individuals all worthy of what New York City has to offer? And so we determined that we needed, as we began this work, a guiding vision. And as I said to the chair on another occasion, this is a nation that was rooted. Essentially, we say that we are a nation where there is no religion that everybody has to subscribe to, but we know that there's a Christianity base. And so, if you look to the Bible says, "Where there is no vision, people perish." New York City does not have a preamble that articulates a vision of what we believe we are and who we are. I heard it said by Kari Lazar-White, the executive director of the community-based organization Brotherhood Sister Soul, that if New York has a preamble that New Yorkers vote upon, it says what we believe, that we believe we are a multiracial democracy where everybody has value and everybody has worth. And we're going to live into a city where everybody, regardless of who they are, who they love, where they live, should have access to a quality education, health care, the opportunity to earn a living and fair wage, the opportunity to walk the streets of New York City without fear of being looked upon as not, being worthy of being in certain places and spaces. So we believed that we needed to lay down a foundational value structure and system for the city of New York, and that it could serve as a guidepost for lawmakers, for government officials as they build out policy and program, for them to live into, to have something to use as their baseline. That's how we decided to do it.
I didn't cut you off, see? The next question I have is, how does the office created by the second ballot proposal work following the establishment of the Mayor's Office of Equity? So if you can talk more about how you would, or how that office would be implemented. I'm guessing it will fall under the Mayor's Office of Equity. I know we have costs, $10 million. Do you think it's duplicative? So any detailed information you want to give about the office that would be created if the second ballot proposal were to pass?
Absolutely. So first, I can't express my appreciation enough to our Mayor Adams for having created the Office of Equity. We have to remember that it exists by executive order, and executive orders can be undone, they can be turned over, and so it was felt by the Commission that it would be a good thing to establish this office in perpetuity, and to do so by changing the charter. Understanding that it's been 400 plus years since we've experienced and lived racism here in this city and in the nation, and so we're not going to undo it in just one mayoral administration. The office, if passed, if this measure passes, would sit within the mayor's office. Now, it does give the mayor discretion to figure out how he wants to set it up, how this mayor wants to set it up. The office would really have to be in existence in full swing by 2024. We appreciate that the racial equity plan that would be produced by this office needs some time to develop the implementation schedule and plan, to figure out what are the indicators, to hire staff, to come on board to help figure out how to move throughout the city and to work with every city agency and mayoral office. We would the mayor would appoint a chief equity officer, but right now it would all sit within the Office of Equity under our Commissioner, Sadia Sherman. And the thinking here is that it is going to build on the work that has already been done by Commissioner Sadia Sherman and by the office, but it's also going to be an organization that is going to emphasize efficiency and working directly with commissioners. We know that there's got to be some work to change policies and programs, but there's also got to be some work to change attitudes, values, and beliefs to help set policy and program. Commissioner Sherman, would you like to add?
Sure. Yeah. Just to build on that, I think, as we've been building out the Office of Equity, we've done so really with an understanding of what's on the ballot, right? And an existing commitment within this administration to begin to build that infrastructure. So to Jennifer's point, to Chair Austin's point, in addition to programs and initiatives and a number of the efforts that are coming out of the office, there's already work happening to really do the deep planning that's required to understand what the technology needs will be, the staffing needs, knowledge and development, culture change work, all of the infrastructure that will be necessary to really make sure that not only the city is able to deliver these plans in 2 years and have this infrastructure, but that it's meaningful, it's impactful, and the city has done the necessary work to make sure that it actually benefits New Yorkers.
And I'll just quickly add, just to be more specific, the Office of Racial Equity would be doing the work of disaggregating data and just building on Councilmember Richardson Jones's questions. It would be centered on disaggregating data by race and ethnicity and other intersectionalities, and then additionally looking at neighborhoods, going neighborhood by neighborhood, and looking at the disparities that exist and that persist, and then building plans accordingly.
Thank you. The third ballot proposal would measure the true cost of living in the city. Can you please explain more about why the current cost of living measurement is not sufficient?
So the current cost of measurement is twofold. There is one cost of measurement that is citywide and it's nationwide. It is the federal poverty measure, which is used to determine who is poor here in America. And that measure says that a family of four living anywhere in America, anywhere, needs just $27,750 to not be poor. It says that a family of three, one adult and two children, needs just $22,000 to not be poor. Additionally, it says that one individual living anywhere in America needs just $12,000 to not be poor. That federal poverty measure is used to help set wages and help to determine eligibility for income supports, child care subsidies, transportation subsidies, housing subsidies, support for food assistance, Medicaid, the list goes on and on. Here in New York City, we adopted a supplemental poverty measure that actually takes a look at when you use the federal poverty measure and then you examine who is eligible for these subsidies that I just mentioned, what is the gap that still remains. So the supplemental poverty measure says that, there's someone who is above the federal poverty level or maybe is at federal poverty level is receiving child care subsidy, maybe receiving a housing subsidy. But still, when what is the gap? Is there a gap in terms of what they actually need to live? The challenge that we have here is that if we're using either one of these measures, the problem that we're having is that we're not actually measuring true cost and dignity. And what I mean by that is, why should we believe that certain people should have to live perennially on subsidies? Why should we be looking at what it costs to just get by and not really be centered on what people really need to actually live? And so we felt that it was important here in New York City to begin to measure what people actually need to live, to use that as our basis, to look at one another as worthy, to look at work, whatever type of work we're doing, as work that is worthy. We have here in New York City people who are working full-time jobs, sometimes working 2 jobs, and they can't make ends meet. So why don't we begin there? What does it cost to actually live? And then use that to determine what fair wages may look like, to help set government decision-making around what we believe are fair wages or what we believe are fair by way of supports to close the gap, help people not just get by, but actually get ahead. That's why we established the measure. And I'll just quickly add, this is a measure that every New Yorker can live into. Every New Yorker can understand and appreciate. Because truthfully, all New Yorkers, whether I should say not all New Yorkers, but many New Yorkers, whether they be persons who identify as white, as black, as of Asian descent, Hispanic origin, there are many New Yorkers, regardless of race, ethnicity, who are struggling to make ends meet, so they can identify. But I'll quickly add, when you live in a nation where black women earn 64 cents on the dollar while working full-time jobs. Women of Hispanic origin earn 56 cents on the dollar for what a white man earns, I should add. This measure really hones in and appreciates how not really accurately capturing and calculating the true cost of living, and then in using that to inform policymaking, can impact people of color disproportionately. When you appreciate that women of color, and especially black women, are the primary and sole breadwinners in their households, and that black women, the most educated segment of our society, when you look at black women on the whole and you look at how within the black female body, that black women are the most educated, and that a black woman only earns as much as a white man, when she has a master's degree, let me back up, when she has a bachelor's degree, she's about equal with a white man with a high school diploma. It's only when she has a master's degree and a white man has an associate degree that she's earning just a little bit more. We have to look at the true cost of living because it's affecting her and her family. It's why 1 in 4 black children lives in poverty compared to less than 1 in 10 white children. We have to focus on the true cost of living.
Thank you for that. Before we go to the Mayor's Office of Equity, and/or ask a little bit more questions about the ballot proposals, just wanted to open it up to my colleagues if you have any questions about the ballot proposals specifically. Good? Okay. You're welcome. The other question I have goes back to the office that would be created. If you could tell us your vision for the agency and citywide equity plans, what information do you expect them to contain, and how do you envision these plans being used by the city? So I know we've mentioned equity plans, but what are we looking at when we're creating these equity plans, and then how will we then implement the plans that are being created?
So the first thing I want to share is, there's been a lot of talk over the course of the last many years about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the approach that has been taken very often the nation over is to center on people at the table, people of color being at the table. I've heard somebody refer to that as now DEI 1.0. If we have a person of color at the table, now the world is much better. But what we've found is that just bringing somebody to the table doesn't necessarily change the way business gets done, right? And it's not to disparage people who are now at the table. But if we're not looking at the products that are developed, the policies that are built out, the programming that is done, the budgets that attend, then it's just having people at the table. What the Office of Racial Equity, and specifically these racial equity plans, city agency by agency, mayoral office by mayoral office, are intended to do is to look at not just who's at the table, but how the city does what it does. To begin by looking at what has been the experience, we have to create a baseline. We have to first go in and measure what these disparities, the disproportionality looks like when it comes to educational outcomes, and then how those educational outcomes are informed by the existing policies and programs. What health outcomes look like and how they're informed by the existing policies and programs. What does it look like when we're talking about garbage being picked up and the streets being plowed? When we put up, what potholes were filled? How many potholes are there in communities of color? And how long does it take to fill a pothole? What does it look like when we've got calls to police officers that something is happening in a community? That we've got, noise, or we've got pollutants in the air. What is the response of the Department of Environmental Protection? And how does that look different? Does that look differently for more affluent communities and lower income communities with people of color? And so first we'd look at the baseline, using data, disaggregated data. And then we'd look at neighborhood by neighborhood. And these plans would go in, take a look at the policies and programs. What we're centering on is design, implementation, and impact. Very often we don't look at what happens until after the fact. And so we've got to use the data, disaggregate it, and look at the data, and then look at what that tells us. Where have we kind of come up short? Has it been in design? Has it been in implementation? Has it been in impact? And then change the policies and the programs using, again, key data points and key indicators to develop a new plan, and then holding ourselves accountable to it. So the plans would be developed, and then in the off years, the City of New York would be required to report out their efforts towards moving the needle. The other thing I want us to appreciate is that we're not just talking about bringing those neighborhoods, those communities of color up by 1 basis point, and then saying that we're done and we're good to go. But really looking at what is the standard at the more, if we want to say the communities where we do not see a greater disproportionate impact based on and looking at communities of color. But what do we need to do to bring everybody up to an equitable level? Is there more that we should add?
Yeah, just to build on Chair Jones-Austin's point, I think that ideally these should be plans that, in partnership with the commission, community, external stakeholders, where we understand what these disparities are and we're collectively defining what better off actually means, right? And then we are building out a strategy to get there and holding all of us, in the city in particular, accountable to that, and we're measuring it on a regular basis. The other thing I would add, while these plans would be designed at the at the agency level, they should intersect, right? Everyone's job is climate, right? It is everyone's job to focus on education, housing, all of the equity domains in our city. It's not any one agency's responsibility, and so the goals should not only be to support agencies in creating these plans, but to provide a framework so that we're all collectively working towards these same objectives, and every agency also understands where their work fits into those collective goals. So a lot of planning to do to get there, but I think that will be important so that we actually get to the root cause and really see that impact over time.
If I may just quickly add, people sometimes ask us whether or not these proposals need to be voted up or down on the whole. Can you vote for one independently? Can you vote for two and not one? Yes, you can vote for one, you can vote for two, you can vote for all three. But they are designed to work together. If we have a preamble that sets forth a vision with guidelines that speaks to what a multiracial democracy looks like, what that looks like in everyday, access, again, to healthcare and education, then a racial equity plan would be, informed by that vision, by that statement of values. And then the true cost of living helps to also bear that out.
Thank you. Something you said reminded me of a previous hearing that we've had. So we also have oversight over the Commission on Civil and Human Rights, and some of the things we talk about with that particular sort of quasi-independent body is sort of enforcement of city agencies. So while we're asking different agencies to create the equity plans, or we're working with them to create equity plans, and then of course we hope that they actually implement the equity plan, what type of accountability is there? And I think this is just like an ongoing question, because how do we, outside of the council bringing in agencies and providing oversight, what type of oversight mechanisms have you been thinking about to really hold agencies accountable for implementing, I'm sure, the many things that will come out of these equity plans?
So, Chair, I appreciate your question, and if I may just quickly share with you that what you're voicing is the sentiment of many New Yorkers who've been long disadvantaged. So what will this do? Will this really accomplish anything? And the first thing that I share with people when I hear that is, if we can begin to change the laws, that is a start. We don't have laws that say that all people are equal and entitled to what those who are more affluent and are of the white race. We don't have those laws that everybody is equal and entitled. We have to begin there. But then we have to do the work of ensuring that these laws have teeth and they have impact. And so what we've sought to do first and foremost is to build a commission and the second proposal would establish a commission in perpetuity that we would be responsible for being the checks and balances on the City of New York, on the mayor's office, to ensure adherence to these, the build-out, the implementation of these proposals. This commission would be comprised of everyday New Yorkers, persons with lived experience who are supported to be in the space, bringing them their whole selves to the conversation and ensuring that whatever plans come forward reflect the experience of everyday New Yorkers. Secondly, the work of the mayor's office would have to be reported out. In the off years, the racial equity plan would have to be updated every 2 years, and in the off years, there would have to be a public report released to all New Yorkers that helps all New Yorkers to appreciate what New York City is doing to abide by their racial equity plans. So that's another checks and balances and a point of accountability. In the proposal, we also provide that the comptroller's office would have an auditing function to make sure that the plans are being adhered to. And then fourthly, what is my fervent hope, and let me just add that I'm so glad that you mentioned the city council's role, because we're so hopeful that you don't step away, and we know that you won't step away. Fifthly, New York City has an opportunity here. If New York City votes for these proposals, they've expressed their desire. And so what we would be looking for New York City to do is to show up and hold the city of New York accountable.
Thank you. I appreciate that. If we can go back to the third proposal around cost of living. I know you so eloquently explained why we are not currently capturing true cost of living, but if you could be more specific or focus in on a portion of your report that mentions that public assistance is currently included and leads to inaccurate calculations. So if you could explain to us why public assistance should be removed from the calculations.
So here's the deal. Let's put it to you this way. I'm just trying to figure out how to best bring this home in the most concise way. There are many New Yorkers who get to move about this city, the nation over, freely and independently. Make it very basic. When some of us go into the grocery, we get to pick and choose what we're going to feed our children and our families. When we look to where we're going to live, we get to decide whether we want to be in this community or in another community. And that's because we have the income that allows us to make those decisions. We're not solely dependent upon subsidies to persist. When we use a supplemental poverty measure, it says we're okay as a people, as a society. We're resigned. So some people just are going to have the government decide how they get to live or how they have to live, sometimes for all of their lives, for their children's lives, and for their grandchildren's lives. Is that fair? And especially we appreciate that here in New York City and across the nation, that disproportionately it is people of color who have to live like that. Is that allowing them to live with dignity? So if we use a measure that says, okay, well, if we just add all of these subsidies, they're okay. They're better than okay if we don't look at, well, what does it really mean to have the same freedoms and the opportunities? What does it cost to have the same opportunities and freedoms? Then we're just going to be living in to this structural system that was willfully, intentionally created by undercounting the number of people who can't make it just on their gross income alone. We are living into a system that is willful and intentionally racist and biased, and we shouldn't be doing that. It is economic deprivation, and it deprives people of the right that many others have to make decisions for themselves, to be heard and to be seen. And that's why I believe, personally and as I serve on this commission, that if we begin to measure the true cost of living, then we're going to look at all people. We're going to look at work as having value. regardless of whether or not you are, somebody who's working in the spaces of law and you're earning, several $100,000, or you're working, frankly, as a legal aid attorney and maybe not making enough to make ends meet. Whether you are a child care provider, working in our community-based organizations, or whether you are, somebody running a hedge fund, that all work has value and worth, and we need to be seen and not be resigned to certain people, because of their professions and the colors of their skin, having to be dependent on income supports to make ends meet.
Thank you. I just have one more final question before I turn some questions to the Mayor's Office of Equity. I know that the commission put forth these 3 ballot proposals, but you have tons of other wonderful ideas. Lots of them I love very much and have already put in some legislation for them. But if you could just talk about some of those other recommendations, I just think it would be good to get it on the record. If there's anything you want to highlight, it doesn't have to be specific, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to, for the record, talk about some of the other very important recommendations that you all have, in addition to the ballot proposals that'll be on the ballot this November.
Would you like to come forward? I'm going to turn, let me first begin. I'm going to ask Jimmy Pan to join us, our Director of Policy, but I want to share with you first that as we were doing this work, we appreciated that there were many issues that fell outside of the charter of the City of New York, where we could not move, issues that concern the state, issues that concern the federal government. We also appreciated that there were issues that were raised that we very honestly did not have the time to engage in, but we felt that they needed to be centered on. And so, Mr. Pan, if you would speak to a few of those, that'd be great.
So I want to start by saying that some of the avenues in which the commission sees work being possible going forward is actually built into the ballot measures themselves. So ballot measure number 2, for example, mentions anti-marginalization work that the Office of Racial Equity could carry forth. So what does anti-marginalization mean? So our theory of change is that actually agencies need to be proactive in undoing the policies and programs and actions that have historically oppressed communities. And so some of how that occurs today.
Sorry, Jimmy.
Yeah, I need to be sworn in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
official stuff.
Yeah. I was kind of looking to see if.
Thank you. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth
Yes.
before this committee and answer all council member questions honestly?
Yes.
You go ahead.
Thank you. And so some of the anti-marginalization work that voters can vote on that the commission has recommended that the office take on would be, for example, looking at wage and occupational segregation, which I know this committee has focused on. Looking at equitable hiring within the city's workforce, which has to involve gathering data and looking at how people are being promoted or retained in the city. Limiting the use of criminal history and background checks, except where necessity is demonstrated. I know some of that is happening in the fair chance, but I know council is in conversation now about expanding some of those avenues. Identifying and employing alternatives to punitive enforcement across all agencies. Making sure that services, information, and decision-making for all New Yorkers is available regardless of language, ability, education, time availability, or expertise. So when we say things like plain language or language justice, concepts which are actually built into ballot measure number 2, these are things that this council, the administration can build upon. And prioritizing resources and services into neighborhoods with the greatest need and largest disparity. We spoke about how the racial equity plans are going to measure neighborhood disparities and identify neighborhoods with the greatest need. But there also could be policy put into place to really think about how we are not just citing shelters, citing waste stations, but also where we're citing hospitals, where we're citing schools, where we're citing services that neighborhoods need. And so even within the ballot measures, there's those opportunities themselves. I want to mention 2 things right off the top, and if I have more time, I'll go into more of the roadmap. This commission highlighted a strong desire for the city to look at reconciliation. Reconciliation involves public naming and acknowledgement of past harms and traumas. a recognition of responsibility in causing the condition that created those harms, and actions to repair relationships and social bonds. And we know that the city is divided. We know that the nation is divided. Reconciliation is a chance for the city to undertake public apology and take reparative actions to those who were harmed. So the preamble, which is about measure number 1 for us, is one step that we can use to begin that reconciliatory process. There's an acknowledgement of harms within that ballot measure. But there could be something more formal that the city takes on, a formal body to examine which things it needs to reconcile and how, in the many forms of reconciliation, it can do so. Number 2 on the top of our list going forward is reparations. There's a lot of discussion now about reparations at the federal level. It's about bringing justice to those who have been impacted by the most severe injustice, thinking about monetary or material compensation. And some municipalities have begun that. There's modest programs that have begun target reparations, for example, in the housing context and in other contexts. California has a reparations task force that it has begun. And we know that full reparations for Black and Indigenous Americans will have to happen on the federal level, just due to the nature of scope that requires. But we think that there's steps that the local government could begin to take. For example, examining historical harms neighborhood by neighborhood, right? Looking at redlining, looking at disinvestment in those neighborhoods, and committing to prioritizing investments where that harm has been documented and found. So those are 2 things that the commission has put in what it's called the Racial Justice Roadmap. And there are many more that I could go into, but I don't want to be sensitive to time.
Thank you. No, I appreciate those, especially the reconciliation, recognition one. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but I was listening to the radio and they were talking about the debate for the Florida gubernatorial race. And they said that DeSantis was talking about like critical race theory. And I think large in part why we want to even incorporate critical race theory and just actual American history, not some other fabrication, but what actually took place here is because it is a place of reconciliation and recognition, and for our children to get that at an early age, so that's already sort of embedded in their psyche. And apparently he said that the land was not stolen, it was conquered, and that, young white students should not be seen as the oppressors, and Black students shouldn't be seen as the oppressed. And I was just like, this is so horrible, because it speaks to sort of, I don't want to say misinformation. It is misinformation, but it speaks to what I think our society has conditioned itself in terms of not acknowledging, not reconciling in real, true ways. And I do believe, in addition to changing the actual laws and doing more programs and policies, but changing the actual laws, at the very least, we have to acknowledge what has taken place, because it's like the truth will set you free. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that, and I thank you for mentioning those other components in your roadmap, because while the ballot proposals are amazing, the roadmap goes even deeper to how we can really get to a place of equity in our city. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I turn my questions over to the Mayor's Office of Equity?
I would just quickly say, Chair, that what is, just building on the points that you just raised, that this is a moment where, as I said when I first began, we can begin as a city to reset the foundation, and whereas before, when this charter was written, it did not, just as the laws of the land across this nation, did not consider persons of color to be equal, to be included in the laws as they were being drafted. We have this opportunity now, and if the city of New York, I should say New York City, chooses to act to bring about these proposals and have them pass, it would provide the opportunity to recast a vision and create a society beginning here in New York where everybody is valued and the lives of everybody matter. My mother would say matter.
Well, what I would like to say is that the work of racial equity moving forward in this country will have to be done on the local level. We can't depend on federal governments. A lot of state governments may be tepid to, step in and do, this work. And so it's up to municipalities. And in New York, we have this opportunity to lead the way. And not only with the commission work, but what we do after decisions made on these ballot measures, that we have this opportunity as a city to set a tone of what we can do around equity and justice for all people. And so having conversations like this, having hearings and having discussions around equity is important so we can engage more New Yorkers. Part of the reason why we are running such an aggressive education campaign, because the day after, I want New Yorkers to stay engaged and be able to hold the city accountable to what we do from here on equity. Assuming the ballot measures pass, how do the implementation process look? If it doesn't pass, then what's next? Because we definitely heard there's a desire to address racial equity in our city. And so the day after, the work continues for us, and it continues to, challenge all of us, like what direction do we go in, what kind of city do we strive to be? And so we put forth these ballot questions as a, not necessarily a starting point, I don't like to use the word starting point, but as a marker of where we need to go as a city, and it's up to New Yorkers to decide if these three questions are the direction we want to go in. But bigger than that is like, how do we actually address inequities that we're facing in the city moving forward?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I always say people vote and then go back to sleep. And so, we want them to vote and we want them to stay awake and stay engaged. And I'm sure there might be some questions that you can answer in reference to the Mayor's Office of Equity as well, because it sort of goes back and forth between RJC and some of the ballot proposals. But Mayor Eric Adams established a Mayor's Office of Equity in spring 22. According to their website, the office will help foster a fairer, more equitable city through policy practices and programs across all city agencies and systems. I love that it says systems in addition to agencies. Additionally, the website indicates that MOE's intersectional approach includes the Commission on Gender Equity, the Racial Justice Commission, the Pay Equity Cabinet, the Unity Project, the Young Men's Initiative, and the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity. In light of this broad swath of entities that fall under MOE, please explain the structure and background of the Mayor's Office of Equity.
Thank you, Chair Williams, and thank you so much for having this hearing and having an opportunity to have this type of discussion. So as you shared, the Office of Equity was established this spring, really with the goal of also bringing together a number of existing equity-focused functions in the city. So this brought together the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity, which I previously had the honor to lead, along with the Racial Justice Commission team, the Commission on Gender Equity, YMI, along with the Pay Equity Cabinet, which is new, and formed under the previous administration, but is being activated during this administration. The goal of the Office of Equity is broad, right, to help foster a more fair and equitable city, but the way in which we've organized our work is really through 5 pillars: policy, systems, programs, engagement, and culture change and practice. A lot of our initial work has really focused on, some deep planning in anticipation also of what is envisioned in the ballot measures, and also just standing up a new office, but at the same time rolling out real programs and initiatives that can reach New Yorkers in real time. So earlier this spring, we were really proud to announce the expansion of universal college savings for all students, right? So if you enter kindergarten and you're in a DOE or a charter school, you now have a New York City scholarship account that's linked to a 529. And not only is this supporting the opportunity gap, but was really seen as a way to address the racial wealth gap. In the spring, we also rolled out an investment that's supporting the LGBTQ+ community with a specific focus on BIPOC-led organizations, transgender-led organizations. There are 7 new programs and initiatives that will come online from that pretty soon. There are some other investments around mental health support and wellness within BIPOC communities, as well as some of the legacy programming that already existed from the Young Men's Initiative, for instance. So a lot of those programs and initiatives are still rolling out, but at the same time, we're starting that planning work that was described. The Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity offers a great foundation for the work that's taking place under the Office of Equity. The task force, similar to the RJC, emerged during a great time of urgency, a time where the disparities in our city were even more compounded and further exposed. The task force brought together city agency leaders. We analyzed disparities by neighborhood, drove resources to specific neighborhoods. And so we're lifting up that work to, one, further analyze the disparities that we see in our city across domains that are not specifically tied to the pandemic, bring agencies together again to really focus on how we drive resources and investment to communities to address disparities, and then really beginning to build out the work that agencies will need at the individual level so that they can get to a place where everyone has not only these equity plans, but that they are really interconnected.
I love that. So similar to kind of the conversation we were having specific to how do you hold agencies accountable, could you tell us the scope of your oversight?
Sure. So I think that, in what's proposed for the ballot measures, Chair Jones-Austin sort of spoke to the accountability, whether it's from the controller or the council, as well as within city government. I can speak to the carrot a little bit more too, right? So, I think one thing that, is an important role of our office is, and I think particularly when we get to a place where these racial equity plans, is that these are plans that, one, tied to the administration's priorities, but also then tied to budget priorities, right? So, as important as it is to hold agencies accountable, it's also important to make sure that resources are tied to the commitments that they have, right? And so these plans also need to speak to the ways in which we allocate resources over time. And we saw that during the pandemic. When we identified those 33 priority neighborhoods, over $380 million of resources and investments were driven to those communities because they were lifted up as a priority. Our office will also serve as this convening body, right? Setting forth a blueprint around these equity goals and disparities, and then really serving as the agency that's supporting all of our counterparts in reaching those goals. The ballot measures would provide more formal oversight roles, right, that go beyond what exists in our current executive order. But all of the commissions and our office have a number of requirements around annual reporting and accountability measures as well too, that not only report on the projects and initiatives that we're directly leading, but also the work that we have underway with agencies.
Thank you. So aside from the final 3 ballot proposals recommended, we know that there are some additional recommendations by way of the roadmap. So is your office considering implementing any of those recommendations outside of the ballot proposals?
Sure. So policy is a pillar of the way in which we're organizing our work. I have the great pleasure of sitting right next to Harold and Jimmy on a daily basis. So, a number of the initiatives that have been outlined in the roadmap are certainly avenues of work that we certainly have in consideration and we consider as we start to build out a policy platform across the office. I would also add that some of the initiatives, the policy proposals that are within the roadmap align to some of the work that we already do. As I shared, the Pay Equity Cabinet is part of the Office of Equity. The Pay Equity Cabinet has a specific goal to address occupational and occupational segregation and gaps within pay within municipal workers. There's funding that the Office of Equity put towards the cabinet to actually complete an analysis to make some recommendations to the city for that work. And so a lot of that is actually moving forward and is certainly aligned to the policy recommendations that are within the roadmap.
Thank you. So are there any proposals that were not in the report that your office or any other entity might be pursuing around equity?
Great question. I think, across the administration, there are a number of equity-focused efforts, whether it's, within our Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, or the Health Department, a number of city agencies that have these types of efforts underway. When we led the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity, we also had an opportunity to make recommendations to the Commission. And some of those recommendations included what's reflected here. There were also some recommendations around how the city can better support social cohesion and community engagement so that it's less transactional. We've been really proud in partnership with the Civic Engagement Commission to help roll out and support community-based coalitions, for instance, so that we're starting to support just on-the-ground infrastructure within neighborhoods beyond the individual engagement that city agencies have with cross initiatives to really make sure that that infrastructure is there. But I would say across the administration, there are a number of efforts, whether it's the investment that's happened in childcare or some of the upstream interventions that are focused on gun violence prevention, to have solutions that are focused on communities of color and the neighborhoods that are experiencing the greatest disparities.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about this. You mentioned that you are currently sort of crafting and preparing for the ballot proposals to pass. So if you could share if you have a timeline, implementation, and enforcement. And another question that I have as I'm just listening to you, and I know you were running the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity, if Proposal 2 passes in November, do you foresee like a consolidation between like that task force and what would be sort of codified as the Racial Justice Commission? How would those two entities that fall under your catchment, how do you feel about what I just said? And then if there's any timeline or implementation, again, for enforcement around creating this office.
Sure. So the ballot proposals also include, also codify the task force as an entity within the city. And then would have a chair, right? So it also changes the structure of the task force a little bit as well. And so I think what we would need to do is really reconcile all the work that's happening right now. But the work that's happening right now is in preparation to be able to implement in that way. And so there's already a commitment for the city to implement in this direction. I think the question is, right, whether it gets codified, by the voters. And so, the size of staff, what we're called, all of the entities, I think that would still, there's 2 years to get to that place, and obviously about a year for a draft plan that the city would have to share. But the actual work and building out the functionalities is the direction that we've been working towards. And I think, there's a pretty specific timeline within the measures, and I think the city would look to stick to that.
Thank you. Yeah, because I am a huge proponent of things being codified because different administrations, new people, but I also just think bureaucracy can be very convoluted. And so while I think the Mayor's Office of Equity is amazing, and I definitely think we need to have a specific entity focused on racial equity work, I do think that perhaps there could be some slight consolidation between the task force and the Racial Justice Commission if it ultimately gets codified. But I think that's what I'm sort of hearing. There's this effort to sort of kind of streamline and condense,
and that's already happened, right? I think part of the goal of creating this Office of Equity was to consolidate what already exists, right? So to your point, I think the goal would be to continue in that direction so that we don't have siloed equity-focused functions in the city, but that we have all equity-focused functions working under the same umbrella, in the same direction, and in a way that's intersectional.
Thank you. And the final question I have is sort of a follow-up because you mentioned there's work already being done to potentially consolidate or streamline. So outside of the task force and the Racial Justice Commission, how do other agencies that fall within your wheelhouse collaborate, or do they collaborate? So is Pay Equity collaborating with the Unity Project or the Commission on Gender Equity? So if you could just speak to how these agencies are collaborating.
Absolutely. So the unit heads for all of those agencies are direct reports to me. We meet on a regular basis. We work together, and as we've been building out the vision for this office, we wanted to make sure that every single office that falls within the umbrella of the Office of Equity, as well as many of our other city agency partners, are part of shaping that. So they're integral to the planning of this office, and their work will be lifted up as part of it as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I really, it just drives me crazy when agencies and entities don't talk to each other. And I see my fave constituent has something to say.
Well, I just want to clarify, Chair, that come election night, the Racial Justice Commission will cease to exist. And if ballot measure 2 passed, then you will have a formation of a commission on racial equity. So I just want to just clear for the record that what you see here will no longer exist in 13 days, but how the voters will decide will determine, whether there'll be a commission, codified into the charter.
Thank you for the clarification. And so I would hope that when it's codified, we're going to speak it into existence, that perhaps the task force, and I'm sure you're already thinking about this because you guys have been doing the work way longer than me, would hopefully fall under the commission.
So exactly. I mean, the way in which we've been working is collaborative across all of our units. And so I think the day after the election, the work continues.
Got you. Thank you. Well, thank you all so very much for coming to the hearing and fielding all of our very important questions. You certainly have an ally in this work, and I look forward to working with you all to implement, to help enforce, and hold these agencies accountable for making our city a more equitable place.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Seeing that we have no other questions, we can now turn to public testimony. We can give the administration a few moments, or the Racial Justice Commission a few moments. Thank you. We will now turn to public testimony. I'd like to remind everyone that unlike our typical council hearings, we are calling the public to testify individually. Please begin once the sergeant indicates they are ready, and council members who have questions can let me know. I would like to now welcome Francesca Perrone to testify. You can go ahead when the sergeants call.
You may begin.
Of the committee for allowing me to present this testimony on behalf of the Hispanic Federation, a nonprofit organization seeking to empower and advance the Hispanic community. I am here to testify today in support of the Commission on Racial Equity and measures that will be on the ballot on November 8th. The 3 New York City ballot initiatives up for vote are essential first steps to make progress on racial and economic justice in all neighborhoods. Latino communities across the 5 boroughs in particular have so much to gain from these ballot measures. As we see it, this election cycle gives New Yorkers the chance to change racial justice as we know it. To achieve higher voter turnout, we recommend that New York City government partner with culturally and linguistically competent CBOs such as the Hispanic Federation to lead nonpartisan campaigns to educate voters on the importance of voting. In a world of misinformation and partisan tactics, it is more important than ever that voters have access to accurate and high-quality information. Often, ballot measures and questions are written in legal jargon that is difficult to understand. It is imperative that the information be distributed in a manner that is clear and concise and in a variety of languages to increase engagement and turnout. At Hispanic Federation, we have a proven track record of leading nonpartisan campaigns that educate members of the public. Hispanic Federation is the go-to and trusted nonpartisan community education leader in the state, and we work with diverse communities to provide neutral and culturally appropriate expert guidance to registered and newly registered voters. HF's campaigns focus on arming citizens with the knowledge necessary to register to vote and how to fill out a ballot, and most importantly, explaining how their participation in the electoral system is critical to our democracy. We owe this success to being the trusted source of culturally and linguistically relevant information for the Latino community. We have a network of hundreds of community-based organizations that are committed to providing Latinos in New York City with every opportunity to cast an informed ballot and make critical decisions that will impact our families. This November 8th, New Yorkers have a chance to make their voices heard through civic engagement. We appreciate the administration's commitment to increasing opportunities for people to engage with policy, practice, and advocacy within their communities. And we encourage the administration to strengthen civic engagement by partnering with trusted CBOs to deliver information to all voters this election season and to encourage them to flip the ballot. Thank you so much for your time.
Did you say that RJC is not working with you? I think we missed what you said.
Familiar with RJC partnering with the Hispanic Federation.
You were muted for part of what you said. Can you just repeat yourself?
Yes, I said I would have to confer with Hispanic Federation, but to my knowledge, we have not partnered with RJC as of yet for the campaigns.
Okay, well, someone from RJC is still here, and so I trust that they'll reach out to the Hispanic Federation, because I think we all need all the help we can get to get out the message for these ballot proposals. So yes, we will follow up with them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, you are free to go, Francesca. And Chair Williams, if you'd like to close out the hearing.
Thank you all for joining today's hearing on such a very important measure. We are urging everybody to go out and vote and flip the ballot. There are ballot proposals on the back of your ballot. We encourage you to check those out. And these ballot proposals will work towards making our city a more equitable place. Thank you all so much.